Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm your host, Lisa Oligas. In this edition, we speak with the author of a new book, Eisenhower for Our Time, an introduction to the Eisenhower presidency that offers lessons for the political world today. Joining us is this author, Dr. Stephen Wagner, a professor of history here at Missouri Southern State University. Thank you, Dr. Wagner, Professor Wagner, for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
This is exciting. Congratulations on your publication.
Thank you.
So this is not your first book about President Eisenhower either. So why him, first off? What is your fascination with President Eisenhower?
Well, it happened in graduate school. I was in graduate school at Purdue University in the 1990s, and it was about that time that there was a lot of scholarly interest in Eisenhower. The Eisenhower Presidential Library had been up and running for 10 or 12 years at that point, and a lot of the Eisenhower papers had been declassified, and so it was like the next new thing that historians were looking at. And so a lot of the graduate students at that time looking for dissertation topics, Eisenhower seemed like a good way to go.
Okay, I mean, those papers do tend to reveal certain things. The
They do.
publication is part of a collection of books called People for Our Time from Northern Illinois University Press. How did you get connected with this collection?
Yeah, so I was contacting Northern Illinois University Press about my previous book, Eisenhower Republicanism, and just had a few questions about sales of that book and things like that. And I didn't get a response back right away. A number of weeks went by, and that was when I realized that my publisher, Northern Illinois University Press, had been bought by Cornell University Press. This happens a lot in the publishing industry. And so my previous book was now being handled by Cornell. Anyway, some time went by. I thought they'd forgotten about me, and I got an email finally from them, and they said, sorry it took us so long to get back to you. We were talking about something. We're starting this new series called People for Our Time, and we think that Eisenhower would be a great subject for that series. Would you like to write another book about Eisenhower for the People for Our Time series? And I was excited about that. It's obviously a great opportunity, and I was glad that they thought that I was the one to write that book. But I hesitated a little bit because I hadn't really planned to write another book about Eisenhower. And also, writing books is hard. I wasn't sure I wanted to write another book at that point. And so I told them eventually, after I gave it some thought, I would like to do it.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll be able to start on it right away. What I want to do is ask my university for sabbatical leave.
Right.
And so the next fall, I applied for sabbatical leave and got it for the next academic year. And so I wrote the book mostly during that academic year.
Which was 2020, during the pandemic.
That's right, 2020, 2021. When I applied for the sabbatical, of course, I had no idea that there would be a global pandemic that would hit while I was on sabbatical. Yeah. And so not only was I relieved from my teaching duties and administrative duties on campus, but the pandemic pretty much took away anything else that I might have been doing during that time.
No distractions then.
Very few distractions. The downside, of course, besides the obvious downsides of the pandemic, are that the Eisenhower Presidential Library was closed throughout my entire period of sabbatical.
Wow.
So I wasn't able to visit the library until a lot of the work had already been done. I had been there before, of course, but I wasn't able to make another trip there.
Yeah. Well, talk about that process of writing a book. I mean, you said it's hard. It's not necessarily easy to do.
It is.
Probably a lot of research, especially because when it's an historical person and someone, a real person, you need to get it right.
Yes. The deadline, the fact that I had signed a contract to write a book before I had written a single chapter of the book, it really focuses you, for sure. And it made me pretty disciplined with the work. But yeah, so I went about it pretty systematically. I wrote it a chapter at a time, meaning I did the research for each chapter and then the writing for each chapter before moving on. Mm-hmm. There were 4 big online collections that I used, so that, given the pandemic, that allowed me to do most of my research from my home study. Mm-hmm. So the Eisenhower Presidential Library has a lot of documents online, And since this was going to be a book that I wanted to be accessible to the general public, the documents that they had online were the ones I would have wanted to use anyway.
Right.
There's another big collection called The Papers of Dwight D. Eisenhower at Johns Hopkins University. And those are online. You have to pay to have access to those.
Oh boy.
But I had that. And then a State Department collection called Foreign Relations of the United States.
Wow.
And then finally, the New York Times archive. So those are the big 4 online collections that I used. So I would spend, for each chapter, 2 or 3 weeks researching the chapter's topic, and then 2 or 3 weeks writing that chapter.
Pretty scheduled then.
Pretty scheduled. When I got to the writing part, especially, I tried to be in my chair at 9 o'clock in the morning and work till 6 o'clock in the late afternoon or evening. If I wrote 500 to 1,000 words a day, I felt like it was a good day. Even though the next morning I would sometimes delete, 2 or 3 or 400 of those words. And
self-editing.
Yeah, self-editing. So the mornings I would spend editing, and the afternoons writing new material. And so I tried to get a chapter done in 6 weeks or so. I felt like that would give me enough time to get through the 8 or 9 chapters that I had in mind and still do editing of the whole thing afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it seems that you have a main theme of good judgment seeks balance. So
Yes.
how did you decide to pursue that? Because then obviously those other chapters supported that theme of balance when it
Right.
came to Eisenhower's presidency.
Yeah. So some people don't realize this. Historians will sometimes write a whole book without exactly knowing what it's going to be about. I mean, obviously I knew it was going to be about Eisenhower, and I had picked the major crises, moments, and big events of the Eisenhower presidency that I wanted to write about. But I don't think I really had the central theme that tied it all together in the way that I wanted until I was writing the last chapter.
Wow.
Because I was really struggling with this people for our time. They really wanted you to take these historical figures and tell the reader, why is this person still relevant to us today?
Right.
And as a historian, we're often taught, be objective. Don't try to take too tough of a stand. Don't try to pull it too much into current events. Be objective. Let your reader make the connections between those times and our times. But this series, they wanted us, be explicit. Tell us what about this person is relevant for today.
Yeah.
And so I struggled with that part. And then when I got to the end, the final chapter, which is on the farewell address, and of course I was writing about the part of the farewell address that everybody knows about, the military-industrial complex. But there was this section at the beginning of the farewell address that really intrigued me, and it included that line that you just used, good judgment seeks balance. And I started to think that that really was the key to understanding all of these other things that I had written about. And so I was able to go back through and kind of weave that back into each chapter of the book, and that really made me know how I wanted to end each chapter with a connection to our time.
So using his own words kind of helped drive
It did.
the theme about
It did.
him.
I think it defines his presidency, and it's a really good connection with our time at the same time.
So you mentioned the farewell address, which is one of the events sort of you cover, but you cover events in Eisenhower's life, and even the decision to run for president, you said was kind of an issue of balance. So let's
Yeah.
discuss that a little bit, and how was that evident?
So where I see that as fitting into the balance is that Eisenhower really did not want to be president. He wasn't a politician. He didn't have some great ambition for the office. But he was a guy who had a real sense of duty to his country. Of course, he spent his entire adult life in the military.
For sure, yeah.
And even after retiring from the military, he allowed President Truman to call him back into service, go to Paris, be the head of NATO, And so he felt this really strong sense of duty to the country. And he was able to be convinced by politicians who wanted him to be a candidate for president, that it was his duty to do so. And he said, well, he wasn't really buying it at first, but he said, if it could be proven to me that this is what the American people truly want, I will do it. And what it turns out is the thing that proved it to him is how he did in the first couple of primary elections. While he was still in Paris, he wasn't even actively running for president, but he was performing well in these early primaries. And it convinced him that this was something that he should do.
You even indicated that there was a lot of mail, that he did get mail from average people saying, we want you to run.
Yes. That collection, the Papers of Dwight D. Eisenhower, it's mostly correspondence. And I read all of his correspondence for that period of time before he decided to run. And yeah, his mailbox was just overflowing with prominent people, regular people, all sorts of people just begging him to be a candidate. And at first he had this just standard no thank you response. But he just gradually was won over by it.
It's amazing. So you talked about balance. He had a social strategy. It was called the middle way. So tell us a little bit about that, and how was that kind of evident of balance?
Yeah. That was really the major topic of my first book, Eisenhower Republicanism. So Eisenhower was very much a political moderate. He was the first Republican president in 20 years, but he really disappointed conservative Republicans in Congress who wanted him to spend his presidency overturning the policies of Roosevelt and Truman, which had come before him. But he wasn't interested in doing that. He really thought that there was a role for the federal government and that he would be ill-advised to overturn popular programs, Social Security, for example. We're not going to eliminate Social Security or farm programs or labor protections, and so he didn't want to do that. Going forward, he wanted new programs, so he didn't want to just not participate, not have the federal government participate in social welfare policy, but he wanted the federal government's role to be a sort of catalyst for private enterprise to fill these needs.
A combination then of both.
Sure. So sort of he saw that as his middle way. He doesn't want the federal government to be responsible for action in these areas, but he also doesn't want it to abandon its role of leadership for these areas.
Which does signal balance. So
it does. Sure.
He was a 5-star general,
yes.
And I mean, rose to the top during World War II. It would seem like national security would be his happy place.
Yeah.
And he created the New Look. So what is that, and how does that fit with this balance theme?
So the way that the New Look, which is what his foreign policy was called, he wanted to continue the Cold War policies of his predecessor, Harry Truman, meaning contain communism, contain the Soviet Union. But he very much didn't want the United States to go broke doing it. He thought, what's the point of winning the Cold War if we go bankrupt in the process of doing so? And so he wanted to make Cold War containment foreign policy more sustainable. So what that ends up meaning is a greater reliance on nuclear deterrence as opposed to conventional containment. And so, although he didn't have any desire to use nuclear weapons, he saw them as a, relatively speaking, inexpensive way to deter Soviet aggression.
Yeah. Well, you talk about McCarthyism a little bit, and the space race as well.
Yeah.
How do those fit into this? I guess Russia was kind of a big thing during his presidency then.
Absolutely.
In multiple ways.
The Cold War, it's interesting, a lot of times when we teach the Cold War, especially in a intro survey course, we almost skip over Eisenhower because there weren't those big flashpoints. The Korean War ends just a few months into his presidency. The Vietnam War doesn't start until after his presidency. We had 8 years of relative peace and prosperity, but it wasn't because nothing was happening in the world. It's because he did a fairly good job of not letting those crises rise to the point of conflict.
Which would make it seem like he had an uneventful presidency, but It was
Yeah.
because he was good at controlling it. We're going to take a quick break.
Sure.
And when we come back, we'll talk about how this research and book can impact students in the classroom. But first, we hear students' reactions to knowing their professor is a published author.
So actually, I saw it on Facebook first on our Missouri Southern page, and I was shocked. I was like, "What in the world?" And then the next day, I came to class and I was like, "You wrote a book?" And he was like, "Yeah, I wrote 3." And then we looked him up on Amazon. It was actually exciting.
But I am proud that he is teaching, but then also learning. I mean, he's still learning, and then he's able to teach us more. He's able to, like they had mentioned, dive deeper into each thing, and I'm excited for him. That's exciting. I couldn't imagine, not only is he a historian, he's our professor, and he's out writing books, and I'm just like, okay, let's aspire to be that.
Do you think it makes him a better teacher in some way?
I think it does. I think he's already a great teacher. I enjoy his class. I enjoy learning and sitting and listening to him, but knowing that he's done all of this investigating and he's learning as he goes, I mean, that just makes you a better teacher, being willing to learn more, even as you get older and as you are teaching other people.
Well, it's always a plus, If somebody wrote about it, he already knows. He's very experienced and qualified in teaching us, the students, on how or what probably went down during history, and can give us the facts and maybe some fun fact or a little unique tip or something like that.
Definitely. I mean, he's a really good professor. He tells the story. He makes it interesting, and I feel like that's what his books would be like too.
Welcome back to Newsmakers, where we are one-on-one with Dr. Stephen Wagner, a professor of history at MSSU and the author of Eisenhower in Our Time. So, Stephen, tell us, what is it like promoting a book?
This is really the first time I've ever promoted a book. When the first one came out back in 2006, I didn't do any of this sort of thing. And so I've done a book signing. I had a book signing yesterday where I gave a presentation and then sold a bunch of books. I had an article on the front page of the Joplin Globe. That was pretty exciting. And I have another book signing this weekend. And of course this interview. So it's been fun. It's a little bit out of my comfort zone. A lot of historians are sort of introverts. Yeah. But I know if you're going to write a book, you might as well get people to buy it and read it. So I want to get it out there.
So who do you hope reads it? I mean, what's a good audience for this book?
So I really thought of this book as more for a general audience. My first book was pretty scholarly, pretty academic, more of a specialist's book. As I wrote this book, what I had in mind was the general educated reader who had an interest in history, and also perhaps an upper level undergraduate. I really hope that faculty at other universities would consider assigning this book in an upper level class. So that's kind of what I had in mind, a more general audience.
You kind of mentioned that when they teach history, they don't necessarily talk about Eisenhower a lot. Was or is Eisenhower typically discussed in today's history classes at all? And how can this maybe impact the classroom?
Yeah, I think, so I teach, one of the classes that I teach is an introduction to U.S. history since 1877. So you're covering a lot of territory, basically from 1877 to as far as you can get. I get to the 1990s.
Heavy World War II,
I get to the 90s in mine, but once you get, you're right, once you get to the end of World War II, things just move really fast. Right. And you might have a couple of class periods to devote to the 1950s. I do the 50s domestic developments and the 50s foreign policy stuff, 2 different days, that's it, 1 week, and you're on to the next, on to the 1960s. So it is an often overlooked decade, and so I hope that this book can help show people that there's more to be known about it than they might have learned in their intro history class in college or high school.
How did writing this inform how you teach and how you share history with students? Do you think it gives you a different way to deliver history when you've done your own research?
I think it does in a couple of different ways. The most obvious, right after I came back from my sabbatical and before the book was complete, I taught a class called Eisenhower and the 1950s for upper level history majors, in which I basically taught this book got feedback from them, used it for revising the book. And so just having to teach what I had written helped me decide whether it was written in such a way that it was teachable. And so the two are very much related, scholarship and teaching. But in a more general sense, when I teach historical research or historical writing or just any historical topic, it just gives you a little bit more credibility. The students are going to know that you know what you're talking about since you've done what you're asking them to do. You're not just telling them to go write a research paper.
Sure.
You've actually done research and writing and for publication. I hope that the students who you interviewed from my class this morning agree with that it gives them confidence in learning from somebody who's learned it firsthand themselves.
Yeah. Well, it's a process
It
too.
is.
And in the classroom, does it give you a different way of presenting context? I mean, one of the things you mentioned is Eisenhower may be viewed differently now than maybe the first year after his presidency.
Yes.
And when the documents are revealed later as to what crises he really did have to handle
Right.
that might not have been public knowledge.
Yeah, I definitely bring up things in class that I wouldn't bring up otherwise because they're not in the standard textbooks because of the research that I've done. I think also in teaching other classes, it affected the way I did the research as well. I teach a course on the civil rights movement, which really affected how I researched the chapter on the Little Rock School desegregation case and Brown v. Board. So it works both ways, I think.
Yeah.
Helps me in the classroom and it helps my students as well.
So Eisenhower was a military leader. Do you think society trusts someone like him more since he led troops into life-threatening situations? And I mean, he was very well known because of being at war.
At the time, I think that was definitely true. There was really no one person more associated with the victory over Germany in World War II than Dwight Eisenhower. And he was a sure thing. Once he decided to run for president, there's no way he was not going to be elected president. Yeah, I think people trusted his judgment and knew that the job wasn't too big for him.
Historically speaking, how important is military service in the leader of our nation? I mean, do you think people weigh that more?
Yeah, not as much as we used to, perhaps. And that could change moving forward since we've had these recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there was a pretty long period of time there between Vietnam and the wars on terrorism that maybe it wasn't as likely for a politician to have served. That could change. Definitely in the 50s, that was something that people thought about because practically an entire generation of young men had served, and so that's what they expected of their leaders.
Yeah. Does that tie in with his call to serve the people and then becoming president, do you think?
I think it ties in with his sense of duty to his country. It was related to the sense of honor and integrity that he carried with him throughout his career, but it also helped him organize his White House staff in such a way as to give him the best information to make decisions. He really organized the White House staff as though it were a general staff in the military. And so it freed him from the day-to-day tedium of political office and freed him to make decisions based on the best information because it had flowed through the chain of command.
Yeah. As you look at politics today, which seem very extreme, very partisan, what do you think people can learn from this book?
Yeah, in my conclusion, so for each chapter I make connections between those times and our times. But in the conclusion, what I try to pull together is the biggest lesson that we have to learn from Eisenhower is this sense of balance, this sense of moderation, this belief that the best possible decision is the one that's in the middle, that Eisenhower I'll have to paraphrase him because I don't have the quote in front of me, but he would say that any decision is wrong if it lies too far to either end of the political spectrum. We have to find a solution that's in the middle. Sometimes that means that we have to compromise, but when we do that, we will win over the greatest number of people. And like you said, we're not doing that right now. And so I think that's the biggest lesson that Eisenhower can teach us.
In fact, it seems like the word compromise seems like it's a terrible thing.
It's a bad word now, for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Which historically are some of the best presidencies, those who can compromise and get things done on both sides?
I think so. So unfortunately, a lot of the compromises of our early history were over slavery. And so we don't think about those as being
Good
compromises in retrospect. But yes, definitely moving forward, I mean, we're a country that has a long tradition of two political parties forced to work together to find common ground in the center. And during the times in American history when we've accomplished the most, the parties have been able to do that, work together.
I know Bill Clinton was considered the king of compromise in his first term.
He was.
And why is it today, how do we get there? I mean, do we all need to read your book and say, we really need to start compromising?
It is interesting. So both parties have moved farther from the center. So nowadays, I think a lot of people would look back and think of Bill Clinton as a lefty, a far left liberal. But that wasn't the case at the time. He was, like you said, something that was called a new Democrat at the time. He was a centrist in that sense. Both parties have moved so far to the polls. I think the Republican Party, Eisenhower's party, has moved farther from the center than the Democratic Party has. But they're so far apart now that the area for overlap, it's just so small. There's so few members in either house of Congress that are willing to participate in bipartisan talks of any kind.
And in Eisenhower's world, I mean, there were a lot of people encouraging him to run for president from both sides, apparently,
Yes.
correct?
Yes. President Truman, a Democrat, urged Eisenhower to run for president in 48 and again in 52 as a Democrat. He said that he would give Eisenhower his full endorsement if he would run for president. So absolutely both parties wanted Eisenhower. It's tempting to say he would have won no matter which party he chose. That might not be true since there had been 20 years since there had been a Republican president. Maybe people were ready for a Republican president.
Right.
Eventually he says, I've always been a Republican. I'm from Kansas, of course I'm a Republican. But it was a sure thing. A huge number of what were called Eisenhower Democrats voted for him.
It's amazing, though, that someone had support from people all
Yes,
across the nation. So,
definitely.
well, an interesting read. Thank you so much for telling us about your book and sharing all this
Yeah,
information.
thanks for having me.
All right, good luck. And that wraps up this edition with Newsmakers. Special thanks to Steve Wagner, author of Eisenhower of Our Time. And thank you for watching.